A masked gunman entered the stable, and the nanny whispered one sentence that turned a horse into a weapon. Mary was hiding in the feed room, counting numbers in the dark, while a killer searched the stable with a silenced gun. Holly had no weapon, no guard, no way out. Only Midnight, the black stallion everyone feared. So she backed toward the stall, whispered, "I'm sorry. I need you," and opened the latch. What happened next made even the Hargrove men understand. Holly Bennett was not helpless. She was lethal in a language only animals understood. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and examine a classic megalomaniacal narcissist. Behavioral science tells us that an apex predator's true pathology is revealed when they are denied control. Weston Hargrove, 36 years old, was the architect of a sprawling criminal syndicate. His name alone paralyzed men, with fear from Boston to Atlantic City. Yet, his psychological baselines was completely shattered by a black stallion. This animal refused to submit. It cost him $1.4 million, shattered the ribs of a specialist from Kentucky, and severed the finger of another. That morning, cloaked in a charcoal overcoat, Weston faced a profound narcissistic injury. He realized he could not break the beast. And precisely then, the anomaly walked past. Enter the subject we will call the disruptor. Her paperwork identified her as Holly Bennett, 27 years old, recently hired to monitor his 6-year-old daughter. Visually, she presented as entirely non-threatening, cloaked in an oversized gray sweater and weathered boots that suggested financial instability. It is a common survival mechanism to camouflage oneself. She was explicitly instructed to avoid the training perimeter. Instead, she halted. For a full minute, she simply observed the violent animal. Her stillness was so absolute that it triggered a primal, herd-level quiet among the armed men in the yard. Then, exhibiting a total lack of normal self-preservation instincts, she placed her glass of warm milk on a post, ducked the rail, and entered the enclosure. In clinical terms, lumps, Weston experienced a complete paralysis of his executive function. He made no move to stop her. Perhaps it was her refusal to seek his permission, a jarring defiance to a man conditioned to absolute obedience. Or perhaps it was the stallion, an aggressive creature that instantly rooted all 4 hooves into the dirt. The moment her boot crossed its boundary, but digging deeper into his psychological profile, I believe it triggered a suppressed trauma response. He felt a phantom echo of the night he met the wife he would later bury. By the time this unknown woman raised her hand and the volatile beast lowered its head in submission, Weston deduced a concrete truth. The woman in the dirt was operating under a fabricated identity. A megalomaniac cannot allow an unsolved puzzle to walk away. His pathology dictated that he must possess and dissect secrets. If you find the psychology of a quiet woman harboring a dangerous truth as fascinating as I do, please hit the like button. Share this case study with those who appreciate a methodical behavioral analysis, and subscribe so our next session finds you on time. Now, returning to the moment of contact, the massive animal stood entirely paralyzed beneath her palm. Its erratic, hyperventilating respiration systematically decelerated into a rhythmic baseline. Holly left her hand on its neck for 2 deliberate beats, silently projecting a calming emotional transference that only the traumatized creature could comprehend. The stallion released a long, steady exhalation, a cloud of warmth suspended in the biting autumn atmosphere. The subject did not engage in unnecessary affection. She offered no verbal reassurance. She merely withdrew her hand with the surgical precision of glyphosate of someone pulling a fragile thread from a wound. Her subsequent physical movements revealed an entirely different history than her file suggested. As she ducked back through the wooden rails, her muscle memory was flawless. Finn O'Donnell, a seasoned observer standing nearby, narrowed his eyes. This was not the clumsy evasion of a domestic caretaker. It was the deeply ingrained conditioning of someone who had navigated hazardous enclosures her entire life. She retrieved the glass, its surface already cooling. She proceeded toward the primary residence with a perfectly regulated stride. maintaining a dangerously flat emotional affect. It was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization, as if the life-threatening encounter had never occurred. The armed men remained frozen in a state of cognitive dissonance. Finn slowly wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, his internal hierarchy shattered, as he realized his professional dominance had just been erased by a nanny. Weston remained anchored for a few calculating seconds before his predatory instincts engaged. He pursued her down the gravel path. When he intercepted her at the wrought iron gate, he displayed remarkable restraint for a violent man. He did not initiate physical contact or raise his voice. He simply positioned himself as a physical barricade, his long shadow projecting dominance across the stones. Holly halted her momentum. Her lack of a startled response was diagnostic. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. The acoustic signature of his voice was not an employer demanding data, but a predator interrogating a mystery that defied his logic. She looked down at the glass. In that microsecond, she utilized a foundational survival lesson taught by her late father. The lesson was simple, but profound. Never reveal your full capacity to a stranger until you understand what they are capable of taking from you. "A long time ago, sir," she replied, her tone perfectly flat. "Your daughter's milk is getting cold. Let's open the file on Weston Harrove, a man whose entire psychological framework relied on absolute control." She walked right past him, stepping into the mansion without a single backward glance. Weston simply stood there, hands buried deep in his coat, his eyes locked on the heavy oak door, long after her shadow vanished. He required submission, and she had offered none. The crunch of gravel broke the silence. Tristan, his brother, stopped just half a step away, his bare hands indifferent to the freezing morning air. Tristan didn't bother looking at the girl. His focus was entirely on Weston's silent calculation. "You want me to dig up her file again?" Tristan asked. His voice was clinically flat, completely dead inside. "Deeper this time. Every old ranch in Montana, every hospital in Seattle she's ever set foot in," Tristan added. Weston let the silence stretch out. "I've studied men like Weston for 2 decades. They process anomalies like a threat to their survival." He catered at that closed door, obsessively replaying what he had just witnessed. The massive, dangerous horse, Midnight, willingly dropping its head into her palm. His megalomaniacal mind couldn't accept it as mere chance. He recognized calculated dominance when he saw it, because it mirrored his own. "Quietly," Weston finally instructed, his voice a low, measured hum. "Don't let her know." Tristan gave a single mechanical nod and walked away. Weston lingered by the stable gate, entirely consumed by the pathology of his own paranoia. A cold wind blew the scent of fresh straw and nervous sweat across the yard. For a narcissist like Weston, the inability to categorize a person is pure terror. He realized she didn't fit his rigid mental boxes. She wasn't an enemy, a friend, or merely a useful pawn. To a mind obsessed with dominance, an unpredictable variable is the ultimate threat. Inside the sprawling mansion, Holly navigated her own maze, heading straight to Mary's room in the east wing. She gently nudged the door open, holding a warm glass of milk. The little girl sat on the edge of her mattress, legs swinging above the floor. She tightly clutched a gray teddy bear with a frayed ear, a classic transitional object, her only anchor in a deeply traumatizing environment. Notice the hypervigilance in the child. Mary didn't even flinch when Holly entered. Her vacant eyes were glued to the morning mist, rolling over the lake, completely dissociated from her immediate surroundings. Holly placed the milk on the nightstand and took a seat on the mattress, carefully maintaining a physical boundary. When you work with severe emotional withdrawal, you learn that proximity is a trigger. Holly respected the space just as a seasoned handler respects a feral, abused animal. "I brought a book," Holly murmured, pitching her tone to perfectly match the quiet frequency of the room. "I thought you might like this one today." It was a textbook de-escalation technique, offering a low-stakes connection without making a single demand. Holly produced a picture book featuring a brown horse in a field of barley. The child exhibited delayed processing, staring blankly before slowly turning her pale blue eyes toward the cover. Those eyes carried the heavy, unspoken memory of a mother she had lost. Holly opened the book and began to read, keeping her vocal effect entirely neutral. No forced enthusiasm, no condescending pitch. Children with complex trauma immediately detect and reject emotional artifice. The clinical neutrality worked. Mary incrementally closed the physical gap. By the 5th page, the girl's small shoulder pressed against Holly's arm. The story perfectly mirrored the girl's subconscious reality. A frightened young foal, hopelessly separated from its herd, wandering blindly through an unfamiliar valley. "Does the horse have a mommy?" Mary whispered. The question barely registered aloud, but psychologically, it was a massive breakthrough. Holly froze, her hand resting motionless against the paper. In that split second, a profound countertransference occurred. She wasn't just a caregiver in a dangerous man's house anymore. She was thrown back to her own childhood trauma in a Montana stable, recalling the harsh reality of maternal separation. "Yes," Holly finally managed, projecting a quiet, steady certainty. "The horse has a mother. Its mother is waiting for it to come home." Mary absorbed the answer in total silence. She looked down at the frayed teddy bear in her lap, her tiny, pale fingers compulsively stroking its worn ear in a desperate, self-soothing rhythm. Holly closed the book and placed it next to the untouched milk. She knew better than to push for a deeper breakthrough. "You and I both know the hardest lesson in life is that real healing requires us to relinquish control, not tighten our grip." She merely pulled the heavy blanket over the child's shoulders and sat back against the headboard. Outside, a lone hawk circled the frozen lake with predatory patience. Then, Holly began to sing. It wasn't a standard lullaby. It was an old, haunting Montana folk song about wild rivers and cold winter stars. It was a generational anchor, passed down from women whose names were lost to history. Inside a mansion run by cold, calculating men, she was quietly building an impenetrable emotional fortress for this broken child. Holly modulates her voice into a low, steady frequency. "Today, you and I will unpack this clinical profile together." She is not offering sweet affection, she is establishing a somatic anchor. By the 3rd stanza, the child exhibits a parasympathetic response. Her breathing synchronizes into sleep. The plush bear is no longer clutched with the hypervigilance of a captive. Holly finishes the auditory conditioning and remains utterly motionless. For 3 weeks, Mary has suffered from nocturnal panic, an obvious symptom of night terrors. Holly provides the exact physical presence required to override this chronic hyperarousal. The psychological takeaway here is remarkably simple. True safety is never loud or performative. It is just the quiet, unbroken promise of consistency in the dark. Weston Hargrove exhibits textbook, avoidant behavior. Anchored to the wall, he never intended to stay. An auditory trigger simply halted his retreat. 3 years of repressed trauma easily erases a father's memory of his child resting peacefully. Watch his physical responses. One hand stays concealed, while the other clenches and releases. This is the somatic discharge of cognitive dissonance. The memory of the black horse, submitting, fused with his daughter's regulated breathing, creates a paradox he cannot categorize. Lacking the emotional vocabulary to process this vulnerability, he refuses to knock. He actively chooses to maintain his rigid isolation. It proves a fundamental clinical reality. Recovery demands that we step through the open door rather than hiding in the dark. He pushes away from the wall, his footsteps unnaturally light. He displays the hyper-caution of a man terrified of shattering his own fragile emotional equilibrium. Meanwhile, Holly retreats to her quarters in the north wing. The small room features a direct line of sight to the stables. This is a severe environmental trigger. She failed to notice it initially. A blind spot completely typical of dissociative avoidance. Returning from her task with the child, she shuts her door, but refuses to engage the lights. She wraps a blanket around her shoulders, a primitive, self-soothing technique to regulate her nervous system, and stares out into the cold dark. It is a very common clinical paradox. We frequently lock ourselves inside the very psychological prisons we claim we are desperately trying to escape. Below the window, the stable lights project a blurred halo. Her spatial awareness locks onto the black horse, 200 meters away. This is severe hyperfixation. She raises her hand to her face. Examine this compulsive behavior. She sterilized her hands 3 times today, scrubbing until the skin inflamed. This is an obsessive response aimed at eradicating a somatic memory, but psychological stains do not wash away easily. Her olfactory cortex still registers the phantom stimuli, animal sweat, damp straw, and leather. It is the odor of a trauma she swore to permanently excise. The cognitive wall she maintained for 8 years suffers a catastrophic failure, collapsing her timeline into one agonizing moment. The past is never actually buried. It just waits in the shadows for the right trigger. The flashback transports her to age 7, reaching for a postpartum mare in a Montana stable. Her father, Jesse Bennett, elevates her, guiding her hand to the precise point of contact. This is the definitive moment of psychological imprinting. He asks if she can hear the animal, his voice rough with gravel. He instructs her that the creature communicates through respiration, micro-movements, and the trembling of its skin. He is effectively teaching her radical somatic empathy. He conditions her to process external stimuli with her entire central nervous system. She absorbed this lesson perfectly. Today, you and I can recognize this as a highly dangerous cognitive gift. When a child taught to feel the slight pain of the world with their whole body, they inevitably end up absorbing those heavy traumas as if they were their own. For 12 years, she engaged in behavioral analysis of horses. By 16, she rehabilitated animals that seasoned men discarded as aggressive. By 18, auction circuits in Kentucky and Wyoming labeled her a whisperer. She rejected the title. Clinically, she was merely applying the advanced sensory processing her father instilled. She was reading physiological data. Then came an October afternoon when she was 19. The subject was a chestnut stallion. Her father had spent 3 months conditioning the animal. Both suffered from fatal confirmation bias. They falsely believed the volatile phase was complete. She stood by the door, holding a bucket, passively observing her father step into the enclosure. It illustrates a grim psychological rule. Assuming you have fully tamed the unpredictable is the exact moment you lose control. The environmental baseline appeared entirely stable. Sunlight penetrated the wooden boards, providing a false sense of routine. The horse remained stationary, its ears directed toward her father, perfectly mimicking a habituated animal. She vividly recalls the somatic memory of smiling. Then, the severe behavioral anomaly occurred. The animal reared violently. There was zero preliminary escalation, no physiological markers that either of these highly trained observers could decode. This specific event shattered her fundamental psychological schema, the naive belief that all behavior is predictable if you just observe closely enough. Exactly 20 seconds elapsed before she dropped the bucket to intervene. But in the brutal mathematics of forced trauma, 20 seconds is always an absolute eternity. 32 years of Jesse Bennett's expertise terminated in 20 seconds. Plunson, bleeding out on a concrete floor he constructed himself. The veterinarian offered no pathological explanation. 2 veteran behaviorists also failed to diagnose the trigger. The clinical consensus was an inexplicable psychotic break, but Holly internalized a much more destructive narrative. Her identity was built on hyper-empathy, on reading the unsaid. In the most critical moment of her life, her sensory processing failed. She firmly believes the animal communicated its lethal intent, and she was simply too blind to intercept it. This is the absolute genesis of survivor's guilt. We would always rather punish ourselves for failing to predict the unpredictable than accept that the world is fundamentally chaotic. Following the funeral, she executed a rapid flight response, liquidating the ranch within 6 weeks. Then we uncover a secondary layer of dysfunction. Her mother had concealed a pulmonary tumor, employing emotional suppression to avoid burdening her husband. The next 6 years degenerated into a cycle of oncology wards and financial deprivation. Holly became the sole caregiver, sleeping in hospital armchairs to ground her dying mother. 2 years ago, the mother finally expired. The residual financial trauma totaled $180,000. At the casket, Holly initiated a strict contractual coping mechanism. She swore to liquidate that debt through sheer attrition. It is a common defense. We often translate insurmountable grief into a quantifiable metric, simply because numbers are far easier to control than shattered emotions. Her second vow was absolute behavioral avoidance. She swore never to touch another horse. For 8 years, she maintained this psychological quarantine. That streak terminated today. Now, in the dark, she studies her fingers, hyper-aware they still carry the animal's scent. The stable lights extinguish below. She remains paralyzed. There is no crying, no sleep, just a catatonic observation of the winter stars. Fast forward 3 days. The temperature drops sharply, the maple leaves oxidizing into brittle brass. The chill of late autumn permeates the grounds. Inside the West Wing, Weston occupies his study, a massive room paneled in dark walnut. It serves as a flawless architectural reflection of his own psychological condition. The space is expensive, highly rigid, designed to enforce isolation, and completely devoid of human warmth. The windows overlook a barren garden, mirroring his emotional depletion. By 9, he has executed corporate calls with Manhattan and Boston. Yet, cognitive dissonance drains his focus. Cold coffee sits beside reports he scanned without retaining the data. Tristan enters with 2 knocks, bypassing his laptop. Today, he carries a physical gray folder. In the pathology of elite families, paper implies secrets too volatile for servers. Tristan places the dossier on the desk, refusing to sit, maintaining strict operational readiness. His tone is clinically flat. He confirms he extracted all intelligence without triggering surveillance, instructing Weston to read it in reverse. It reminds you and me of a dark psychological truth. Unearthing someone's hidden trauma might feel like an act of protective control, but it is ultimately a poison. Tristan divides the intelligence. Verifiable data at the front, profiling at the rear. Weston uses silence as a dominance display, opening the 14-page dossier. Defying his brother, he reads chronologically. He needs to analyze how the system documented her before trauma fractured her. Page 1 is the foundational anchor. Holly Margaret Bennett, born in Gallatin County, Montana, March 11, 1998. The parental variables are established. Jesse Bennett, equine behaviorist. Rose Bennett, primary educator. Pages 2 through 4 contain academic metrics from Bozeman High School. Weston is aggressively scanning the documentation for a behavioral anomaly, searching for a pre-existing psychological fracture. But the empirical data refuses to yield. It only presents a perfectly stable, unremarkable baseline. The timeline accelerates toward the catalyst. Provisional admission for animal science in 2016. By page 5, the trajectory aborts, with a deferral in 2018. This is the moment her psychological scaffolding collapses. Page 6 delivers the trauma. Jesse Bennett S. death certificate. Cause of death: head trauma from an accident. Weston S. reading decelerates for a microbeat. He recognizes the somatic weight of sudden grief. Pages 7 through 10 document the protracted agony of Rose Bennett. Lung cancer metastasizing to stage 4. 6 years of systemic failure, culminating in a penalty of $180,000. Expiration date, April 2024. Page 11 maps her survival response. A descent into menial labor until her transfer to Manhattan 8 months ago. You and I must understand this clearly. This dossier is not a resume. It is a clinical autopsy of a shattered life. In behavioral analysis, we look for what is called a baseline. No criminal history, no outstanding debt aside from medical installments, no familial attachments, save for a distant aunt in Idaho, contacted annually. Weston processed this profile, seeing a subject defined by systemic loss rather than pathology. A woman managing trauma without malice. It rationalized her mute compliance. It rationalized her worn boots. It completely failed to explain the equine anomaly. He turned to page 12, the off-the-record dossier Tristan acquired through illicit channels. He began to read, and by the fourth sentence, his autonomic nervous system stalled entirely. Stillness is often the first symptom of a shattered assumption. You and I are going to unpack this psychological rupture together, because sometimes our greatest talents are the very things we bury when trauma strikes. Jessie Bennett's only daughter possessed highly specialized behavioral conditioning, known in Western equestrian circuits between 2013 and 2018 simply as the Whisperer. By 15, she was recruited by a Kentucky racing syndicate. By 17, she rejected a $600,000 contract from a Texas ranch. By 18, industry publications documented her methods. Then came the ultimate trauma, her father's death in October 2018. A complete dissociative fugue followed. She erased her existence for 8 years. Weston reread the file without blinking, then closed the folder. Noticed the proprietary physical gesture. Weston held his hand against the folder exactly the way a subject hesitates before breaching a confined space. Tristan remained perfectly static, observing the shift in his employer's behavioral baseline. No physical contact with her, Weston finally commanded, his vocal tone clinically flat. Cease all surveillance. Absolute containment of this data. Tristan provided a single nod of compliance. Weston extracted his phone and initiated a call. Finn answered after 2 rings, his vocal cords thick with morning lethargy at 10 a.m. Weston bypassed all social pleasantries, operating purely on control. Finn, your utility has expired. Leave by noon. A prolonged pause echoed on the line as Finn's survival instincts calibrated to this sudden termination. He had existed in this high-stress dynamic long enough to recognize when inquiry becomes fatal. Good luck with that animal, Mr. Hargrove, Finn replied, demonstrating complete submission rather than hostility. With the human asset eliminated, Weston terminated the connection. He secured the dossier within his private drawer, engaging the lock to assert absolute environmental control. Yet Tristan remained rooted to the floor. For the first time, Tristan observed his brother with an entirely foreign affect. He was diagnosing a profound shift within Weston psychopathy, a reminder that obsession often begins in total silence. The atmospheric pressure collapsed near midnight, arriving 2 hours ahead of meteorological projections. Wind violently agitated the water, and precipitation descended in aggressive horizontal sheets. At 12:15 a.m., a massive electrical discharge struck an oak near the perimeter, sending acoustic shockwaves through the architecture. But it was not the atmospheric violence that shattered Holly's sleep cycle. It was a highly specific auditory trigger she had been conditioned to recognize since age 7. The distinct rhythmic concussion of a massive equine skull against timber. She immediately transitioned to a waking state. Outside, personnel scrambled in total systemic failure. Her motor functions executed a deeply ingrained trauma protocol. Denim, a heavy textile sweater, completely bypassing any superficial grooming behaviors. She moved through the corridor with tactical urgency, pausing at the juvenile's quarters only to visually confirm the child remained unconscious, clutching a transitional object despite the severe auditory stimuli. Holly then proceeded to the ground floor, executing 2 sharp, methodical knocks on the caretaker's door. Otis Knox responded within 3 seconds, exhibiting physical disorientation. Holly offered no extended social narrative. Mr. Otis, she stated flatly, the child is asleep. Guard the corridor. He analyzed her affect and nodded. Half a century entrenched within the Hargrove family dynamic had firmly conditioned Otis to distinguish between a polite suggestion and an absolute command. He wordlessly secured a thermal layer and moved toward the designated sector. Holly breached the rear exit, enveloping herself in a waterproof shell to mitigate the severe environmental exposure. The distance to the isolation unit measured precisely 50 paces across crushed stone, yet acute stress radically distorted her spatial perception. The precipitation battered her in a relentless percussive rhythm. Arriving at the containment zone, she observed 6 individuals entirely paralyzed by the bystander effect, refusing entry. Within the enclosure, the specimen exhibited a textbook catastrophic panic response. It occupied the deepest corner, forelimbs trembling erratically as its central nervous system failed to process the sensory overload. Salivary hypersecretion coated its mandible. The structural integrity of the rear barrier was heavily compromised. With every subsequent lightning strike, the creature propelled itself forward, using its own cranium as a blunt instrument. Holly physically displaced a paralyzed handler to clear her trajectory. A vocal warning registered from the periphery, predicting her immediate termination upon contact. But she completely ignored the negative reinforcement. Breaching the door. Stick with me here, because you and I are witnessing a masterclass in behavioral de-escalation, proving that the most powerful response to chaos is often absolute stillness. She deliberately avoided any forward trajectory. Instead, she methodically shed her protective outer layer, folding it with compulsive precision. Then, she descended to the dirt, adopting a submissive posture against the opposing wall, pulling her lower extremities inward. The massive animal fixated upon her, its respiratory rate severely elevated, yet the self-mutilating behavior ceased. She denied it direct ocular contact, fixing her gaze upon her own idle hands. Become the floor, not the storm. The subject began to recalibrate, mechanically shifting its immense mass. By the 7th minute of sustained exposure, the animal expelled a massive volume of trapped oxygen, its auditory receptors relaxing from their defensive pinning. Holly maintained her strict visual avoidance. By minute 10, she initiated a steady vocal modulation. Verbalizing memories suppressed for nearly a decade, she detailed the acoustic resonance of rain on a tin roof, and a childhood trauma involving the loss of a mare named Maple. Her pitch remained rigorously flat, devoid of emotional spikes, mimicking clinical detachment. By the 16th minute, the physical distance between them rapidly decreased. She refused to introduce any sudden motor movement. Instead, she exposed her jugular by tilting her cranium backward against the timber, deliberately sealing her eyelids to remove the final predator dynamic. At precisely the 20th minute, the creature's she registered the thermal output of its respiration before the staggering weight of the animal ace skull collapsed onto her shoulder, a 600-kilogram entity anchoring its absolute vulnerability to a remarkably fragile human frame, their respiratory cycles synchronizing perfectly. She offered no active tactile reassurance, merely resting her palm on its muzzle. Beyond the perimeter, the paralyzed observers remained entirely mute. We must examine this closely, because you and I are watching a megalomaniac experience genuine cognitive dissonance. It shows us that even the most hardened minds can be disarmed by pure vulnerability. Weston occupied the narrow threshold, his tailored garments saturated, rainwater streaming down his face. He had sprinted from the primary residence upon hearing the distress signals, yet he remained completely paralyzed in the violent weather. He was observing a subject who had rigidly maintained trauma-induced avoidance for 8 years, suddenly absorbed the terror of his most volatile asset. Watching that lethal creature seek comfort against her collarbone fractured something deep within Weston's psychopathy. In behavioral analysis, we often see trauma manifest, not as panic, but as hypervigilance. By 5:30 in the morning, the sky outside the Harrove mansion was a cold, bruised gray, and Holly was already moving. She hadn't slept since her encounter at the stable. Sleep requires a lowering of defenses, something her nervous system simply wouldn't allow. She stepped into the vast, pale marble kitchen, seeking the quiet anchor of routine. She needed the physical ritual of making coffee before the house woke up, before Mary's needs demanded her attention. It was 10 minutes to 6, and the sprawling room was entirely hers. The staff hadn't stirred. In my practice, I've learned a simple truth. Silence is sometimes the only sanctuary a fractured mind can tolerate. The head chef wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. Holly moved with methodical precision, setting her own filter on the counter and the kettle on the induction stove. Then came the soft, betraying creak of the rear porch door, followed by the heavy tread of leather shoes. Most people would startle, but Holly didn't even turn around. Her threat assessment was already calibrated. Weston stepped into the shadows of the kitchen, deliberately choosing not to turn on the overhead lights. He wore a steel blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from a shower. Notice his physical positioning. He stopped exactly 3 steps away from her, close enough to assert his presence in his territory, but distant enough to avoid triggering a flight response. He just stared at the humming kettle. Let's look at this exchange carefully, because this is where the psychological posturing begins. You didn't sleep, he stated. It wasn't a question, but an observation of her vulnerability. Holly immediately mirrored him, a classic defensive mechanism. Neither did you, she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the kettle. Then Weston laid his true intention bare. He wanted her to train the horse officially. He didn't frame it like a boss dictating terms, but like a man who had spent the night wrestling with his own need for control. He offered a private contract, completely outside her agency's jurisdiction, designed to fit around Mary's schedule. It was a subtle, almost clinical maneuver to enclose her entirely within his own sphere of influence, masking dominance as opportunity. He offered her 5 times her current salary. For a man accustomed to absolute authority, money is simply a tool to purchase compliance. But watch how Holly reacted. The kettle hissed, and she calmly pressed the button. She didn't freeze or rush. She measured the coffee grounds and poured the boiling water as if he had merely commented on the damp morning weather. Then she turned, leaned her hip against the cold stone counter, and crossed her arms. In body language, that folded posture is a barricade. She looked directly into his face. Her expression wasn't that of a subordinate dazzled by wealth. It was the cold, calculating look of a survivor who had already run the variables. I will work with the horse, she said, her tone perfectly flat, yielding absolutely no emotional ground. But I won't take the extra money, she told him. She insisted her agency's salary would remain unchanged, keeping Mary as her primary focus, giving the animal only her leftover hours. Weston stared at her, his cognitive dissonance laid bare. He looked like an analyst reviewing a psychological profile where every variable suddenly proved false. Why? He asked. Her response was immediate. I will do it for the horse, not for you. The statement wasn't designed to be cruel. It was an assertion of autonomy. By stripping the financial transaction away, she neutralized his primary method of control. In my line of work, we call this breaking the behavioral loop. In the 3 years since he took over the empire, Weston had never met someone who refused his resources without facing absolute ruin. No one had ever dismantled his authority so effortlessly. Weston couldn't respond with his usual hang-handed tactics, because there was nothing to push against. She wasn't making demands, she was simply building a wall he couldn't buy his way over. He stood in silence for a long moment before giving a single, tight nod. Fine, he conceded, turning toward the door, but men conditioned by absolute power rarely let an interaction end on a loss. Hand on the doorknob. He paused, turning just his head. You still haven't told me the truth, he murmured. It was a classic probing tactic, trying to induce guilt. Holly didn't even glance at him as she poured her coffee. You still haven't asked the right question, she replied. She had flipped the psychological mirror right back onto him. He stepped outside, shutting the heavy door without making a single sound. The moment the room was empty, Holly set the glass filter down. Her hand hadn't trembled, but she suddenly exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath during that entire final exchange. We often mask our deepest anxieties so well that even our own bodies forget to breathe. Maintaining a rigid boundary against a dominant personality takes an immense neurological toll. Outside, the bleak gray horizon finally warmed to a bruised copper. Over the following days, the fractured household settled into a specific, unspoken routine. Holly honored exactly what she had outlined. Her mornings belonged entirely to Mary, guiding the child through lessons. But when the afternoon arrived, she surrendered herself to the stables. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Her methodology with the traumatized animal was pure exposure therapy. She refused to use a bridle or a whip. Instead, she carried a cloth bag of sliced apples and a low wooden chair, and for hours, she simply sat in the dirt. The aggressive trainers were dismissed, leaving only 2 young hands who learned to keep a wide distance. She was rebuilding the animal's shattered baseline of trust. By the 2nd week, the dark horse allowed her to comb its mane. By the 3rd, it accepted a saddle, though she made no attempt to mount. She whispered that she wasn't ready, a quiet projection of her own internal damage. By the 4th week, she shifted her behavioral tactics, leading a gentle, golden-brown pony named Biscuit into the adjoining training yard. Mary stood gripping the wooden fence rails, her eyes wide with apprehension. Despite living on an expansive estate, the traumatized child had never once been placed on a horse. Holly had secured Weston's silent, single-nod approval days prior. She gently lifted the girl onto the saddle, placing her tiny, tense hands in the coarse mane. Biscuit was a 14-year-old veteran of a clinical therapy center, radiating a slow, rhythmic calm. For the first 60 seconds, Mary was rigid, locked in an autonomic freeze response. Then, her nervous systems enregistered the steady, non-threatening movement of the animal beneath her. The pony tossed its head softly. Suddenly, Mary laughed. It was the unrestrained, unguarded sound of a child, finally dropping a psychological shield she had carried for far too long. It was a pure, echoing sound the girl hadn't made since her mother died on the balcony, barely 30 meters from where they now stood. Up above, Weston remained hidden behind the thick glass of a tall window. He had been heading to his study, but that sudden auditory trigger of joy paralyzed him. He didn't step out to join them. He simply pressed his hand against the wooden frame. In the clinical world, we see how profound grief builds fortified walls within the human psyche. In that single moment, 3 solid years of meticulously engineered silence collapsed inside his chest, unleashing an emotion he lacked the vocabulary to process. He watched from his self-imposed isolations until Holly lifted his daughter down to the dirt. 2 days later, he formally summoned the quiet Nanny to dinner. A man with his pathological need for control rarely issues an invitation. He relayed a message through his staff that he required her presence in the small dining room at 8 o'clock. Holly possessed exactly one formal garment, a faded black cotton dress purchased from a thrift store for her own mother's funeral half a decade ago. It was a lingering artifact of her own unhealed grief. She tied her hair back and descended the stairs precisely on time. Weston sat at the head of the table, in a gray shirt, lacking a tie. But note this behavioral anomaly: when she entered the room, he actually stood up. It was an uncharacteristic concession of respect. They spent the meal in a highly regulated, comfortable silence, sticking safely to the neutral topic of Mary's sudden fascination with the pony. They masterfully avoided their respective minefields. She didn't ask about his corporate empire, and he didn't probe into whatever trauma she left behind in Montana. Once the table was cleared, he guided her into his private reading room. The space was claustrophobic compared to the rest of the house, walled in dark wood with a fire burning steadily in the hearth. This physical shift in environment was entirely intentional, a calculated transition into vulnerability. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, a chemical crutch to temporarily lower his rigid inhibitions, and offered her one. She declined, choosing to sit opposite him with a clear, unaltered mind. For a long time, only the crackle of the flames filled the heavy silence between them. Finally, he stared into the fire and spoke. "My wife, you and I have probably both witnessed this kind of deep survivor's guilt." His voice was eerily steady, rehearsed endlessly in the prison of his own mind. His wife died in a car explosion meant for him, simply because he altered his schedule and sent her instead. He had carried that secret for 3 years. Holly didn't offer empty platitudes, recognizing that a traumatized mind actively rejects pity. Instead, she offered a reciprocal confession. "I was 19, she murmured. She admitted to missing the micro-expressions of a panicked horse, a failure to read the behavioral baseline her father taught her, resulting in tragedy. She missed the 3-second warning. Weston set his untouched whiskey down. "You had 3 seconds to save him," he observed coldly, locking perfectly onto her lifelong guilt. "Let us open this case file together, you and I. Look at their first interaction." "I had 6 hours to tell her to take another car," Weston noted. For hours, neither spoke. The only sound was the night wind scratching an oak branch against the glass. They remained at opposite ends of the room, separated by a profound psychological gulf. Yet, within that wood-paneled space, an unspoken transference occurred, a shift in their behavioral pathology that neither dared to name. They maintained strict physical boundaries. When she finally retreated to her quarters, his ego wouldn't allow him to ask her to stay, but observed the anomaly in his rigid routine. For the first time in years, his poured whiskey remained unfinished. The lesson here is simple. Even the most hardened patterns can be broken by a single moment of silent connection. Now we examine Audrey Prescott. She arrived that Tuesday afternoon in an ivory white Mercedes convertible, purchased with a massive bonus from Hargrove Capital. She gave no warning of her arrival. For 5 years as Weston's personal attorney, and 2 years serving as his intimate confidant, she operated under the illusion of permanent access. She presented as the apex predator of Madison Avenue camel-colored coat, red-soled heels, blonde hair immaculately cut. Climbing those steps with her legal folders, she informed the guard of a Delaware divestiture. While factually true, it was a textbook diversion tactic. She was driven by an obsessive need to reassert control over her territory. We often see this in clinical practice. The truth is never just what is spoken. True motives hide beneath of professional necessity. Spant. Weston received her in his study precisely at 3 o'clock. For 40 minutes, they dissected documents with the clinical efficiency of partners conditioned to each other's rhythms. Audrey executed her signatures. She pushed the papers across his desk and leaned back to observe her subject. She was primed to deliver a calculated statement, meticulously rehearsed during her commute from Manhattan. Yet, before she could vocalize her manipulation, an external stimulus shattered her focus. Beyond the study window, moving across the gravel yard, Holly came into view. Notice how quickly a mental state collapses. The lesson is profound. You can rehearse your reality indefinitely, but life will always introduce an unexpected variable, instantly shifting the entire psychological environment. Holly presented without pretense a blue flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, hair loosely tied, her gait remarkably stable. Weston, pen in hand, involuntarily broke his focus when her shadow crossed the glass. It was a micro-expression, lasting barely a second, before he resumed signing his name. But Audrey, highly attuned to his baseline behavior, caught that fleeting fixation. Before his wife's passing 3 years ago, Audrey had been the recipient of that exact gaze. The narcissist rarely shows vulnerability, but a perceptive observer recognizes it. Audrey internalized this threat instantly. Maintaining her composed facade, she requested tea. He instructed Mrs. Otis to prepare the ground floor sitting room. 10 minutes into Audrey's calculated wait, Holly walked past. It teaches us a grim truth. Jealousy is a quiet hunter. It does not scream. It waits patiently for its target to pass. Audrey initiated the confrontation, modulating her vocal tone to sound artificially sweet. "You are the new nanny, aren't you?" she asked. Holly paused, offering a polite affirmative. Audrey then deployed a smile weaponized by a decade of corporate psychopathy. "I only wanted to introduce myself. I am Audrey, the lawyer. I know the women Weston desires, and the ones he inevitably discards." She used a deliberate pause, visually dissecting Holly from her worn boots upward, establishing a dominance hierarchy. "You seem to belong to the second kind. Do not misunderstand me. I mean that kindly. This is textbook psychological warfare, designed to destabilize a subject's self-worth. If we observe carefully, we learn that cruelty is rarely delivered with a shout. The most damaging blows are spoken softly, wrapped in a false veneer of helpful advice. Fascinatingly, Holly exhibited zero autonomic arousal. No blinking, no trembling. Holding her untouched tea, she absorbed the verbal assault without a fluctuation in her baseline emotional state. "Thank you for your concern," she replied calmly. "Mary is waiting for her milk. I wish you a safe drive to the city." A minimal nod, and she removed herself from the toxic environment. Audrey was left standing alone, her predatory smile evaporating instantly. Her attempt to trigger an emotional response had completely failed, leaving her own narcissism deeply bruised. Unable to process this defeat, Audrey fabricated an urgent phone call to Mrs. Otis and fled without finishing her tea. We must remember this crucial life lesson. You neutralize an aggressor's power the moment you refuse to react to their provocation. Composure is the ultimate shield against manipulation. But let us track Audrey's next move. Instead of leaving directly, she deviated to the basement corridor housing the security control center. After 5 years as legal counsel, she possessed legitimate access to these highly secure systems. Slipping inside, she isolated herself behind a closed door. 20 minutes elapsed before she emerged, her legal folder firmly in hand. The on-duty staff completely ignored her presence. Cognitive habituation made her practically invisible to them. Inside that room, she had maliciously manipulated the mainframe, programming a digital backdoor into the safe room system. A vulnerability so microscopic, only the architect would detect it. This demonstrates a chilling reality about human trust. The most dangerous threats rarely break through our front doors. They walk right in with the keys we willingly handed them years ago. Audrey departed the compound at 7 in the evening, under the cover of darkness. 10 miles down Highway 32, she executed classic covert tradecraft. Pulling into a desolate gas station, she retrieved an untraceable burner phone and dialed a memorized contact. After 3 rings, a connection was made. "Mr. Whitfield," she stated coldly, "I think it is time we talked." Her pathological need to destroy her rival was set into motion. Exactly 9 days later, the psychological pressure test began for Holly. Sorting her mail near the inner gate, she discovered a stark white envelope slipped between her bills. No postage, no return address, just her name, inscribed in black ink with artificially rounded letters designed to mask the author's identity. The takeaway here is sobering. True malice is rarely spontaneous. It is planned in the dark and delivered quietly to your doorstep. Bathed in the pale light of the hallway, Holly opened the envelope. Inside lay a folded sheet with 2 sentences. "If you are still there by next week, someone dies. Could be the little one." She processed the threat twice. The physiological shock, the numbness in her legs, was delayed, a common neurological response to severe trauma. It hit her only after she secured herself inside her locked bedroom. Sitting on the mattress, she analyzed the text a 3rd time. The phrase targeting the child induced acute hyperfocus, dominating her psychological state. Her mind projected images of little Mary in the classroom, recalling the bright memory of the child's laughter flashed weeks prior. This exposes a fundamental human vulnerability. The swiftest way to break someone's resolve is never to threaten them directly, but to place the innocent in the crosshairs. Her cognitive stream fixated entirely on the child. Clinically speaking, it is highly significant that Weston never entered her thoughts during this panic phase. Her maternal transference was absolute. She visualized the little girl sitting downstairs, oblivious to the danger, coloring a solar system diagram. Adrenaline forced her to her feet. Adrenalis her behavioral choices. She bypassed Weston's study entirely. She avoided Tristan. Her logical reasoning concluded that involving them would trigger a territorial lockdown, forcing her to stay and finalizing the lethal threat against Mary. She had already lost her father to a 3-second hesitation years ago. The past teaches us harsh truths. When deep trauma is triggered, we often isolate and flee, believing our absence is the only way to keep loved ones alive. Her survival instinct dictated she would not lose another life to a preventable variable. She extracted the worn travel bag that had carried her from Seattle to Manhattan 8 months prior. She began the methodical process of packing her sparse inventory. 2 sweaters, 3 shirts, 1 dress, socks, and her alternate boots. The procedure consumed under 15 minutes. It was only while folding the final shirt that her suppressed emotional state fractured. Tears struck the fabric before her brain registered the sorrow. She wept in absolute silence, a mechanism conditioned by 6 years of maintaining vigilance in her mother's hospital rooms. Collapsing to the floor beside her luggage, she surrendered to the grief, her face uncovered. Then, the bedroom door cracked open. We learn from this that profound grief is rarely loud. It is a quiet, heavy burden we try to pack away in the dark. Let us pause and analyze this interaction together. There was no knock. 6-year-old Mary stood at the threshold, clutching a paper crane. The child had detected a faint auditory cue in the hallway. Tragically, it was a sound this little girl was deeply attuned to the suppressed weeping she had absorbed during her own mother's terminal decline. When Holly looked up, her emotional exposure was complete. Yet, Mary exhibited zero anxiety. Processing the distress, the child entered, meticulously closing the door to secure the perimeter. She approached with measured steps, sitting on the floor at a very specific proximity. It was the exact distance a traumatized child learns to maintain when a caregiver is compromised. She did not initiate physical contact immediately. Children often understand emotional boundaries better than adults do, waiting patiently to offer comfort. Mary executed a fascinating de-escalation technique. She placed the unevenly folded blue paper crane on the floor, establishing a physical bridge. Holly identified the object as a torn page from a coloring book she had recently purchased. Then, the child bypassed all psychological defenses with a direct appeal. "Please do not go," Mary stated. Her tone lacked any tremor. It was devastatingly clear. "Daddy needs you. I need you too." Holly experienced complete vocal paralysis. She extended her arms and the child seamlessly closed the physical gap, holding onto her neck. Holly compressed the girl tightly against her chest, grounding herself in the scent of mild soap and afternoon milk. The profound sentence is that raw vulnerability disarms our deepest survival instincts. A simple plea from an innocent is often the only anchor that stops us from fleeing. As we conclude this session, observe the psychological reset. Holly maintained the embrace, using silent co-regulation to stabilize her nervous system. Gently pushing the child back, she dried her face, reclaiming her executive function. She then executed a symbolic act of defiance. Retrieving the extortion letter, she dismantled the threat, tearing it into halves, then quarters, then eighths. Mary observed, instinctively understanding this protective ritual, without asking questions. Compressing the shredded evidence, Holly stabilized her vocal register. "I am not going anywhere. I am here." The child validated this, offering the paper crane as a token of their bond. That night, Holly slept in an armchair beside Mary's bed, transforming into a protector. The ultimate truth of human nature is revealed here. Love does not cure fear, but it gives us the absolute conviction to stand our ground in the dark. Today, you and I are going to unpack a fascinating behavioral case file together. Look at Holly. Her travel bag sat half empty on the floor, a physical sign of her internal conflict. She chose to stay and protect the little girl, unaware of the surveillance net around her. Tristan, the security chief, possessed the hypervigilant paranoia typical of seasoned enforcers. He had concealed a lens above the staff mailboxes. His target was not Holly, but Audrey. He caught Audrey's nervous baseline immediately. When she asked for tea, she never drank. 40 minutes before Holly collected her mail, Tristan found his proof on the overnight footage from 11 at night. An unmarked pickup truck idling by the gate. A gloved man stepping out, slipping an envelope into the box. The drop took under 4 seconds. The courier masked the plate with black tape, an amateur evasion tactic that meant nothing to a mind like Tristan's. The visible letters led straight to a shell company in Yonkers. This is a classic psychological masking technique. I have seen countless times in federal prison records. It traced directly to the empire of Brandon Whitfield. From a second-floor window, Tristan documented the letter with a telephone, retrieved it. Speaking, Tristan demonstrated remarkable impulse control here. He refrained from breaching her room, allowing her time to process the emotional shock of the letter. Instead, he took the raw evidence straight to his brother. Weston analyzed the photograph document without speaking a single word. He reviewed the text twice, his face a perfect mask of cognitive processing. Tristan offered no verbal report, having already verified the data against security logs. Only one external individual had accessed that control room during Audrey's visit, acting with profound deceptive intent. Weston placed the paper face down. For 60 seconds the room held a suffocating silence. When he finally spoke, his vocal bass line remained completely flat. Yet, the microtones carried a cold detachment Tristan had not witnessed in 3 years. "Bring the courier here," Weston ordered. He instructed them to isolate Holly and the little girl from the situation. Keep them in a total information blackout. This is exactly how apex predators secure their environment before they initiate a calculated hunt. Tristan nodded, executing the order. By 10 o'clock, they extracted the courier from a decaying motel in Poughkeepsie. The man offered zero resistance, showing the passive surrender of an operative who knows he outmatched. They transported him to a derelict warehouse on the property's further edge. Crucially, this structure existed outside the digital surveillance network. Around midnight, Weston approached the building on foot. He wore a long, dark coat, making the solitary walk with deliberate steps. Inside the cavernous space, Tristan and Stu and Force waited in the shadows. They had designed a highly intimidating, perfectly controlled psychological theater. This was a textbook interrogation setup designed to methodically shatter the subject's mental defenses before a single word was spoken. Stick with me, because this is where the behavioral dynamics get chilling. A single bulb illuminated the concrete, isolating the courier. He sat unbound, a tactic that induces absolute hopelessness. For 40 minutes, the interrogation proceeded unrecorded. From outside, one could only hear Weston's perfectly modulated voice repeating 3 questions. This was followed by silence, the sharp crack of wood on stone, and then the same questions again. Weston's shadow projected against the wall, utterly unhurried. By 1 a.m, the courier staggered out. He was physically intact but psychologically broken, having surrendered every detail, including his handler's contact data. Weston returned to the main house at 1:10, entirely unaffected, not even bothering to change his clothes. He proceeded directly to the reading room, taking the same armchair he had shared with Holly weeks prior. He called Audrey at her Madison Avenue residence. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice thick with sleep and anxiety. Weston bypassed pleasantries entirely, commanding her to drive to the estate immediately. This abrupt disruption of a subject's safe space is a potent control mechanism. Audrey arrived at 3:15 in the morning. She had wept through the long drive, navigating the mist on Highway 32, in a state of emotional freefall. When she entered the study, Weston remained seated. There was no alcohol, no paperwork, just a darkened phone resting on the wood. Demonstrating absolute territorial dominance over the environment, he pointedly did not offer her a seat. Audrey stood paralyzed, her makeup smudged. She attempted a frantic defense, but Weston severed it instantly. He gave her 3 hours to flee the state, his voice a terrifying whisper. By 6 a.m, her safety would evaporate. Audrey collapsed, weeping that she never believed Brandon would go to such extremes, crying that she still loved him. Let's look at this closely. Audrey's condition mirrored a former patient of mine, Luca. It is severe Stockholm Syndrome. She remained fiercely devoted to Brandon, a man operating with the exact blueprint of a notorious mob boss. I once profiled the kingpin Vittorio. Brandon was a textbook, megalomaniac narcissist, manipulating her grip on reality. Weston heard enough. He walked past her crumpled form, exiting the room in absolute silence. Audrey fled the property at 10:10 in the morning, driving without headlights in a desperate display of prey behavior. From his second-floor vantage point, Weston watched her taillights vanish. With the external threat neutralized, he addressed the internal fracture. He navigated the corridor to Holly's room, delivering 2 precise knocks. 10 seconds elapsed before she opened the door. She remained in her previous day's clothing, her physical state broadcasting severe sleep deprivation and elevated cortisol levels. His gaze locked onto the fully packed canvas bag on the floor behind her. He studied the luggage, then shifted his unblinking focus to her face. "You were going to leave," he stated. His tone lacked any trace of anger, presenting only a flat, clinical observation of her flight response. His voice carried the heavy friction of psychological exhaustion, laced with a rare vulnerability. "You should have come to me first," he murmured. Holly remained anchored in the doorway, knuckles white against the wood. Her verbal defenses failed completely. What followed was a week of profound silence. In the criminal underworld, this absence of stimuli is known as an acoustic shadow, a highly dangerous precursor to violence. Brandon made no contact. Audrey vanished. Tristan's intelligence network gathered only static. Yet, Weston refused to de-escalate. He doubled the armed perimeter, imported 4 heavy operatives from Boston, and positioned a tactical reserve unit at a hotel 12 miles away. He was actively constructing a fortress of pure, calculated paranoia. He calculated he had fortified every vulnerability. He was incorrect. You might be wondering the same thing I did. How does a mastermind slip up? By trusting history over behavioral data. At 4 on Saturday afternoon, a Boston associate with a decade of loyalty called. He reported a logistical failure at Charlestown Harbor, requiring Weston's immediate physical presence that night. Weston exhibited extreme hesitation, deliberating for 20 minutes. He analyzed the scenario with Tristan, who volunteered to lock down the estate. At 7 that evening, Weston entered his daughter's room. The child was sketching the sun, entirely insulated from the threat. He kissed her head, promising to return before lunch. 20 minutes later, he crossed paths with Holly. The psychological board was set. Weston paused during their hallway encounter. His brain wrestled with an urge to speak, but emotional suppression won out. He offered a curt nod. She mirrored it. His vehicle breached the perimeter at 7:35, 3 hours into the drive. On Highway 90, the Boston associate messaged Tristan. The opposition had supposedly vanished, canceling the meet. Tristan relayed this data instantly. Weston absorbed the information in absolute silence for 3 seconds. In that brief window, he recognized the deception. He violently reversed direction at the nearest exit. Dialing Tristan, he issued rapid commands to evacuate Holly and Mary to the subterranean bunker immediately. No explanations. Tristan bolted to the upper floor, adopting a deceptively placid tone to mask his adrenaline spike. He quietly instructed Holly to move the child below. Holly processed his micro-expressions for 2 seconds before sweeping the lethargic child into her arms. They descended into the East Wing basement, a space smelling of sharp cedar and damp stone. They approached the decoy oak door, concealing a reinforced steel vault. Tristan punched his code into the biometric keypad. A red error light pulsed 3 times. He repeated the sequence. 3 more flashes. He applied his thumb to the reader. The machine emitted a single dying beep and powered down entirely. Internal sabotage. At that exact second, the violent crack of a rifle echoed from the outer gate. And here is the harsh truth we all eventually learn. The walls we build to keep our demons out are often the exact same walls that trap us inside with them. The illusion of absolute control had shattered. The siege had officially begun. Let's open this case file. You and I are going to unpack the architecture of trauma. Tristan muttered a quiet curse, shielding the child from his panic. He drew a side arm, turning to Holly with a strict directive. The perimeter was compromised. She needed to hide the girl immediately. He handed her an iron key for the stable's side gate, then bolted upstairs toward the violence. Holly stood paralyzed in the basement, clutching Mary, The little girl was awake, her pupils dilated from the severe stress response, yet she hadn't shed a tear. "Miss Holly, where are we going?" she whispered. Holly dropped her voice to a soothing, calculated rhythm. "We're playing hide and seek." It reminds us of a fundamental truth. In moments of pure terror, we often mask the horror with childhood games, just to keep our fragile minds from snapping entirely. Holly continued the psychological framing, laying down the rules of their game. She enforced a protocol of absolute silence until a trusted adult returned. Mary nodded with the solemn comprehension of someone trapped in a war zone. Holly hoisted the girl, pushing out onto the dark service path. The night was a sensory void, punctuated by the sharp reports of gunfire at the gate and the shouts of men. Instead of succumbing to blind panic, Holly exhibited a textbook freeze and assess response. She waited behind the door, counting to 5, to track the acoustic direction of the threat. Pressing the child's face into her shoulder to shield her from the trauma, she bolted. She counted exactly 50 steps over the gravel. In times of crisis, focusing on simple mechanical tasks is exactly what prevents the human mind from completely shutting down. She refused to look back at the mansion, employing an instinctual block against visual trauma. At the stable, she slipped inside and sealed the door. The interior was a vacuum of silence, broken only by the rhythmic respiration of the horses. Midnight, a massive animal in the farthest stall, pinned its ears up at the intrusion. Holly ignored it, functioning purely on survival adrenaline. She moved directly to the feed room, a fortified enclosure packed with dense sacks of oats and bran. She shoved 2 heavy bags apart, engineering a makeshift concealment chamber, just large enough for the child. She placed Mary inside this dark hollow. Gripping the girl's shoulders, Holly locked eyes with her, projecting complete clinical authority. True resilience isn't the absence of fear. It is the steady ability to maintain control over your immediate environment when your entire world is violently collapsing. Holly layered her behavioral conditioning. She told Mary to grip her stuffed bear as a grounding tool, ordering her to count to 100 slowly and loop the sequence. She drilled a strict boundary into the child's mind: do not open the door for anyone, and maintain absolute silence no matter what happens outside. Mary processed this with chilling compliance. Recognizing a primal shift in Holly's eyes, the girl understood the danger completely. After a rapid kiss to the forehead, a crucial anchor of affection, Holly exited the enclosure. She bolted the latch from the exterior, sealing the child inside. Through the thick wood, the whispered numbers began to rhythmically echo. 1, 2, 3. Holly stepped back, ready to barricade the entrance. It is a sad reality of survival that we sometimes must lock the innocent in the dark, just to ensure they live to see the morning light. Just as she moved, the door was violently breached. An intruder entered, wielding a suppressed firearm. His frame was shrouded in a dark coat, his features obscured by a heavy scarf. His predatory gaze swept the stable before locking onto his target. This is a fascinating psychological juncture. Holly stood exposed in the center of the room, mere yards from where Mary was whispering her numbers, showing extreme emotional regulation. Holly refused to glance back at the hiding spot. Instead, she locked eyes with the aggressor and initiated a deliberate retreat toward the opposite end of the building, toward the stall where the massive horse stood alert. The intruder didn't utter a single syllable. In the clinical dynamics of predator and prey, the weapon communicates the threat. In lethal confrontations, calculated silence is always the most terrifying psychological weapon of all. The intruder leveled his weapon, advancing with a slow, predatory cadence. Holly mirrored his pace, executing a calculated backward retreat while maintaining unbroken eye contact. She deliberately suppressed her flight response, knowing that running would only draw his attention toward the hidden child. She had to manipulate his spatial focus entirely onto herself. She retreated until her spine connected with the door of Midnight's stall. She could feel the massive animal's hot exhalations on the nape of her neck, its body radiating intense heat. The horse crowded the door, ears pinned flat in a universal sign of mammalian aggression. The man halted exactly 4 paces away. We often forget that underneath our civilized masks, humans are animals too. Sometimes, our greatest chance at salvation lies in trusting the raw, untamed instincts of the natural world. Let's look at this critical moment closely. The aggressor elevated his firearm, establishing a lethal trajectory. Holly knew her timeline had expired. She possessed only one variable he lacked. Tilting her head back, she verbalized a desperate plea, a whisper only the massive beast could register. "I'm sorry, I need you." She snapped her hand backward to disengage the heavy iron latch. Shoving the barrier open, she violently redirected her body, flattening herself against the partition. The horse, an explosive mechanism of kinetic energy, breached the confinement in a heartbeat. 600 kilograms of muscle bypassed her entirely, launching directly at the foreign threat. The man's reaction time was vastly outmatched, allowing him to discharge only a single, panicked round. When backed into a corner, weaponizing your immediate environment is the ultimate survival tactic. The bullet embedded itself into the timber, mere inches from Holly's head. The attacker simply couldn't manage a second trigger pull. The acoustic resonance of the horse's hooves, impacting his chest, sounded like the catastrophic failure of a heavy wooden beam. The intruder crumpled, his weapon skidding away. Midnight maintained a dominant posture over the neutralized threat, stamping into the straw. Then, exhibiting remarkable autonomic regulation, the animal retreated. Its respiration was jagged, nostrils dilated from the adrenaline dump, yet the aggression ceased immediately. The beast locked eyes with Holly. In that quiet exchange, she processed a profound realization. The creature had accurately categorized the behavioral signatures of the two humans. Loyalty isn't just a human construct. It is a primal biological currency earned through mutual trust. Holly collapsed against the partition, her nervous system processing the physiological crash. The cortisol spike left her legs weak. She simply couldn't move. The sound of footsteps crushing the exterior gravel triggered a secondary stress response. The door was violently breached again. Tristan filled the frame, displaying signs of a brutal altercation, a lacerated shirt, and a smear of foreign blood on his cheek. He rapidly processed the chaotic data matrix, the neutralized assailant, the vigilant animal, and the traumatized woman. Lowering his sidearm, he dropped out his voice to a non-threatening register to ask her status. She gave a singular nod, her protective programming immediately reasserting priority. She reported Mary's secure location, emphasizing the child's cognitive isolation. A true guardian always prioritizes the mental safety of a dependent over their own physical trauma. Tristan absorbed the data and transitioned into the protocols of a high-levels enforcer. He exhibited no manic urgency. His movements were brutally efficient. He initiated 2 brief phone calls. Within minutes, 2 operatives arrived, clinically extracting the attacker's body on a canvas tarp. Tristan then assumed a non-threatening posture, crouching low by the feed room. He opened the door just enough to establish an auditory channel, modulating his voice to project paternal warmth. He inquired about her counting protocol. The child's numerical response confirmed her cognitive compliance. Tristan offered positive reinforcement, extending her timeline to ensure the violent cleanup was finished. Crucially, he left her physical isolation intact. Crisis management often requires deceiving the vulnerable to preserve their fragile mental reality, a cold but strictly necessary survival mechanism. Stick with me, this is where the psychological dynamic severely fractures. Weston materialized in the doorway, a chaotic deviation from his meticulously controlled presentation. His structural barriers were compromised: an open overcoat, soiled fabric, a discarded necktie. As in a single hypervigilant sweep, he absorbed the forensic data. He cataloged the weaponized animal, the ballistic damage, and the traumatized woman clinging to the wall. He noted her facial lacerations and the neurological tremors racking at her hand. Bypassing his subordinates entirely, he advanced directly into her personal space. For the first time since their introduction, he initiated direct tactile contact. This was not the sterile, boundary-conscious interaction of a corporate superior. It was a profound psychological tethering. Extreme trauma instantly disintegrates artificial social hierarchies, exposing the deeply raw, codependent bonds lying underneath. He locked her against his chest, engineering a physiological cage of dominance and perceived safety. One hand secured her shoulder, the other anchored the base of her skull, enforcing her submission to his protection. A micro-tremor cascaded through his frame, an involuntary somatic release that only she could detect. This is the exact genesis of a severe trauma bond. Holly exhibited zero defensive resistance. She did not repel his intrusion, nor did she actively reciprocate. Yet she yielded the weight of her head against him, adopting the submissive posture of the deeply traumatized. Her exhausted whisper simply confirmed the psychological integrity of the child. By dawn, the facade of the megalomaniac's empire was flawlessly restored. The visual evidence of chaos, the ballistic projectiles, had been clinically extracted. The grand illusion of perfect safety is a controlling narcissist's most effective tool of psychological imprisonment. Let's look at this together and decide what it means when evidence vanishes. The structural lacerations were packed with synthetic resin, erasing the trauma from the environment. Biological fluids were eradicated via high-pressure cleansing. The perimeter was repaired before the sun could expose the violence. The neutralized hostile assets were vanished under the cover of darkness, along undocumented routes, by a specialized sanitation crew. This clinical erasure of human life is exactly how a sociopathic organization sustains its control. The syndicate operated on a strict principle: violence must never leave a physical stain. It is this psychological warfare, the terrifying ability to render reality completely malleable, that ensures their name evokes profound dread in the closed chambers of Boston and Atlantic City. True power isn't just surviving a lethal attack. It is successfully convincing the rest of the world the attack never even happened. Let's open the case file. By 7 a.m, the child, Mary, was engaged in what we call normative masking. Tristan had relocated her to her own bed hours prior, and she had counted to 197 before the door opened. Counting is a classic grounding technique for an anxious mind. Sitting there with maple syrup on her pancakes, she recounted a dream about a black horse and a fox. Weston, the father, joined her, kissing her head. Notice the child's selective blindness. She did not ask about the fresh laceration on her father's hand. In criminal households, children instinctively learn not to see the violence. It is a survival trait. Meanwhile, Holly had bypassed the kitchen entirely, retreating to the stable by 6. Holly sat by the stall with a small medical strip Tristan had placed across her forehead, a physical marker of the previous night's trauma. The black horse stood close, resting its heavy neck against the wood. In clinical terms, we see this as somatic co-regulation, two nervous systems stabilizing each other in complete silence. Weston entered this space at 8:15. He had stripped off the blood, showered, and wore a loose gray shirt. Watch his spatial awareness. He brought coffee and sat beside her, not too close to trigger a flight response, not too far to seem detached. They shared the quiet, staring at the animal. Then, he shattered his own psychological quarantine. "My wife's name's Clara," he finally said. "You and I have to understand what it takes for a man of his profile to speak this way." His voice was entirely stripped of the calculated armor he wore in the reading room. He detailed the timeline. Married at 27, his wife Clara an architect, the birth of their daughter. Clara knew his true profession and tolerated it for 4 years. He stared down into his coffee cup, performing what we call a verbal autopsy. He described the overlapping appointments, the fatal decision to send her to inspect a warehouse in Queens. Then came the absolute raw admission of guilt. He confessed he knew his vehicle had been tracked by rivals. He stripped away his own denial. He wasn't making excuses. He was clinically indicting himself for her murder. 40 minutes of negligence, he admitted. That was all it took. Holly kept her gaze fixed on the horse, anchoring herself. Weston then articulated the core of his trauma response for 3 years. He operated on severe avoidant attachment. If no one got close, no one could be taken from him. He maintained that isolation until Holly stepped into his training yard. He paused, his coffee going completely cold. Then, he outlined a massive behavioral shift. He was systematically deseeding his criminal enterprise, restructuring the capital into legitimate assets for his daughter. A 5 to 7 year transition plan, while Tristan handled the dirty work until it was sanitized. He made it clear this wasn't a manipulation tactic. It was truth. Here is where the power dynamic permanently shifts. He presented his question. Would she stay to witness his rehabilitation? Holly did not rush to fill the silence. We must analyze her response carefully. Is this a variant of Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim falls in love with their captor or enemy, or is it conscious agency? She put her cup on the ground and rested her hand over his. Her hand was shaking from adrenaline, but she refused to mask it. She allowed herself to be entirely vulnerable, giving him one deliberate nod. This wasn't trauma bonding. It was a conscious choice. Weston stared at her hand before turning his own over, lacing their fingers together. No force, just a grounded, mutual psychological anchor. The horse exhaled a long breath, and the three of them remained completely still as the morning sun cut through the stable boards. A collective regulation of trauma. Jump forward 6 months. The criminal network surrounding the estate experienced a radical shift. The antagonist, Brandon Whitfield, exhibiting the classic traits of a megalomaniac narcissist, was arrested by federal agents in an Atlantic City hotel. He was taken down not by a hitman, but by a massive paper trail. An independent attorney in Washington handed over 400 pages of financial crimes and recordings. The family name was completely absent. Weston had executed his rival through legal channels, a complete psychological manipulation, and a sublimation of his usual violence. Look closely at how they restructured their environment. The syndicate began the exact transformation Weston had promised that morning in the dirt. Tristan assumed control of the illicit operations, but managed them with a strict mandate for closure. It was a controlled demolition of a criminal empire. 0 expansion, 0 new acquisitions. They held the structure steady, carefully untangling the violence, so no one else would become collateral damage. Meanwhile, Weston shifted his entire cognitive focus to legitimate ventures investing in agricultural technology and healthcare. This was a man actively rewriting his own neural pathways, rejecting his violent history. And Holly? She had evolved far past the subordinate role of a nanny. By early spring, Holly took definitive agency, launching an equine therapy program for displaced children from the city. Weston funded it entirely in the shadows, keeping his criminal stigma away. She named it after her father, the Bennett Horse Program. This was her reclaiming her lineage. The Black Horse, Midnight, became a focal point for these traumatized children, acting as a passive, stabilizing presence from its stall. For little Mary, the animal functioned as a primary confidant. She would stand at the rail every afternoon holding a carrot, debriefing the horse on her day, while it listened with total calm. Then came a warm afternoon in April. Mary burst from the house, sprinting across the grass with a folded piece of paper. Let's examine this moment of psychological integration. Weston and Holly were watching a young foal acclimate to the yard when Mary ran up to them. She shoved the folded paper toward her father, then quickly adjusted and offered it to both adults. It was a crude drawing of 4 figures: a blonde man, a brown-haired woman, a little girl, and a massive black horse. Above them, written in the clumsy print of a 6-year-old, were the words, "My family." The child had officially mapped her own safe psychological environment, effectively diagnosing their bond before the adults even could. Weston stared at that drawing until the reality of it sank in. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket like a physical anchor, and looked at Holly. The little girl sprinted off, entirely unaware she had just rewritten the emotional reality of the 2 adults. Weston's voice was low when he asked, "Will you stay? You and I need to recognize the difference here." 6 months prior, he was asking for time to change. Now, I was asking for permanence. He was asking for a lifetime. Holly didn't react blindly. She processed her environment: the child, the silent animal, the fading afternoon light. "I didn't come here to fit in," she finally told him. "I came here to belong." That is the ultimate rejection of the victim identity. She claimed her space. He held out his hand and she took it. The air was thick with the dust of the yard. But it was no longer the heavy dust of impending violence. It was just the dust of an ordinary day. This was an environment where a former kingpin, a survivor, a child, and an animal had literally rewired themselves to exist together safely. As a behavioral analyst, I can tell you that we are not defined by our traumatic triggers or the defensive walls we build, or the defensive walls we build. True recovery happens when we have to observe someone's darkest pathology, acknowledge it, and consciously choose to stay. Some psychological wounds do not fade with time alone. They only close when another person chooses to sit and listen, rather than trying to control or conquer. Secure attachments are rarely strictly biological. They are constructed from small repetitions: a warm glass of milk, a paper crane, hands in the quiet sun. We have reached the end of this case file. If reviewing this dynamic has struck a nerve, if you understand that the individuals sitting in absolute silence are often the ones masking the most profound psychological weight, hit the like button so this case study can reach others. Share this analysis with someone whose nervous system might need stabilization today. Subscribe to the channel, and together, we will continue to dissect the complicated wiring of the human mind. Let me ask you, what is your clinical assessment of these subjects? Of hallucination? Of Weston dismantling his empire? Did you see your own defense mechanisms reflected here? Perhaps you identify with Holly, carrying the crushing weight of your environment entirely on your own. Or perhaps you recognize yourself in Weston's clinical detachment. You and I have probably both witnessed that specific kind of avoidant behavior, the deeply ingrained belief that the only way to protect yourself from further loss is to maintain a strict emotional quarantine, refusing to let anyone cross your perimeter. We build these psychological prisons, mistakenly calling them fortresses. Or maybe you see the shadow of someone else in your life. Someone whose silence you misread as anger, when it was actually just a profound trauma response for survival. Leave your psychological profiles in the comments below. Take a close look at your own attachments and ask yourself what walls you are still defending. Keep your eyes open until our next file.
One of the most meaningful lessons from Holly Bennett's story is that true talent does not always announce itself loudly. When Holly first appears at the Hargroves estate, she is not introduced as a famous horse trainer or someone with a remarkable past. She is simply the new nanny, quiet and easy to underestimate.
Yet, the moment she steps into the training ring and calms Midnight, the dangerous black stallion no expert could control, everyone realized there is far more to her than her
Paperwork suggests. This teaches an important educational lesson. People often carry hidden gifts that are not visible through job titles, clothing, social status, or first impressions. Holly's ability is not based on force, dominance, or performance. It comes from listening, patience, memory, and deep respect for the animal fear. In a world where many people try to prove themselves through noise and power, Holly proves herself through stillness. She does not need to shout, command, or impress. She simply understands what others fail to hear. This is valuable for viewers because many people feel overlooked in life. They may believe their quietness makes them weak, or that their past pain has erased their worth. Holly shows the opposite. Her silence contains experience. Her gentleness contains mastery. Her humility does not mean she is ordinary. Education should teach us to look deeper before judging anyone. A person working as a nanny may once have been a gifted trainer. A person wearing worn boots might possess knowledge that money cannot buy. Hollier's story reminds us that real talent does not disappear because the world stops recognizing it. Sometimes it waits quietly until the right moment asks it to return.